But they said that this child had last been seen in the company of a known paedophile. Again, I arrived. This little boy had been reported missing by his mother, and a search revealed the wee soul was dead. Spent the entire night painstakingly photographing, videoing the scene while they recovered Mark's remains. There was a police cordon around the place. They knew from CCTV who he was. He was nowhere to be found. And then during the course of the evening, he turned up at the cordon with a pizza, asking for access to his house. And the cops asked him what his name was, and he said Stuart Leggett.
Good evening, Tom. How are you this evening?
I'm very well, Simon. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm fantastic. And Tom, we've got a very special guest tonight, who's actually a self-declared fan of Crime Time Inc., which is fantastic. Martin Lupton. Good evening, Martin. How are you?
Good evening, Simon. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. And I suppose I should ask you, how did you get to hear about us in the first place?
I think I stumbled upon you on the Strathclyde Police Friends Facebook page.
Ah.
I thought, well, that looks interesting.
Okay.
I was particularly interested in the series about the World's End murders,
right,
and the ones about the Robert Black inquiry. And I also found it quite fascinating listening to Tom's input from the senior officer's perspective about the miners' strike and crowd control, allocation of resources and major CID inquiries. It's things that you would not get to hear of from somebody at that level who was actually still serving. Yeah, became an avid listener of it.
And you became a subscriber and you got in touch. I think it was through Facebook or Messenger that you got in touch and asked a question, and that's how we got to where we are tonight. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, yeah. Of course, I read your book, having seen you on the Professor Watson programme.
Oh, yes.
You were talking about, shall we say, slightly nefarious police practices with regards to interrogating a suspect who had a hostage at the time, or whose cohorts had a hostage at Govan Police Station. It raised a little chuckle and, some happy memories.
I got a phone call about that from Strathclyde Police. But that's another story. I
remember thinking, does this gentleman understand that there's no statute of limitations in Scotland?
What I was going to ask you, Martin, was we're having a chat here and nobody knows who you are yet. So I was going to ask you to introduce yourself, if that's okay, and tell us a wee bit about your background, your police background, and prior to the police as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, okay. Prior to the police, I was pretty much a middle-of-the-road student at school. I was obsessed with all things to do with aviation, to be honest with you. But I never had the physique or the brain power to go into anything meaningful in that line of work. I studied photography for a couple of years at college. Nobody that was leaving the courses in the years prior to me were getting work in photographic industries. So I knew a couple of local ladies who were married to firemen at the time. And I thought, that actually sounds quite a good way of life. The shift system appealed, 2 night shifts, 2 day shifts, 4 days off. Driving in a big shiny red Falcon. I thought, yeah, I think we can. We'll go and settle into that. So went into the job centre in Maryhill, inquired about this to be told that the fire service weren't actually recruiting at the time, but what about the police? They gave me an application form and said, well, fill it in and see how you get on. And there we were, retiring 31 years later.
What year was that you joined, Martin?
I joined in 1982, February 1982, which was the day the junta in Argentina took the decision to invade the Falklands.
No connection?
No connection whatsoever. So I went through the training, and my first night operational on Group 2 at Clyde Bank was on the 30th of May of that year, the night before Pope John Paul's visit.
Did you live in Glasgow or the north of Glasgow? Was that local to you? I
was brought up in Mulgai. The Maryhill Job Centre just happened to be the nearest one.
Okay, we were recruiting a lot at that time, Tom, 1982. Was that a big recruitment drive, do you think, going on?
Yeah, it was. Recruitment in the police comes cyclically, and it all stems from the Second World War. Martin, you're a history buff, so because of the disruption and the fact that a lot of people were kept on during the war and there was a mass exodus at the war, so then a lot of people came in 1946, 47, and they all retired at one time. And so there's always been this wave of recruitment, which has gone on and goes on still because of the 30-year service. But Martin, can I just point out to you that I'm pleased you're from Mulgai, but Mulgai's more like Edinburgh than Glasgow. I mean, it doesn't really qualify as being from the west of Scotland, Mulgai.
You're probably right. You're probably right.
Your first shift was quite significant, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was night shift. It was the 30th of May in 1982. That was the night before the visit of Pope John Paul to Glasgow the following day.
You'll remember that, Tom. You would be heavily involved in that, I would imagine, in the policing aspect, of course.
Yeah, I was. I remember it well. I mean, for very good reasons, Pope John Paul decided to visit Glasgow, but to stay in Edinburgh. He stayed at Cardinal Gray's residence, which is up on the south side of Edinburgh. And for my sins, myself and my little squad from the Serious Crime Squad were designated as being responsible for the security of Cardinal Gray's house, and therefore the Pope. It was funny because I remember the first thing we had to do, of course, is secure the place and then search it for any explosives. And I'll never forget that we had to, of course, it was all done by dogs at that time. And so the bomb dogs went running into the huge kitchen. It's one of these big old houses, got a big old kitchen, which, of course, there were a lot of nuns working in the kitchen. And these dogs come in the kitchen, scattering stuff everywhere. And the nuns all running for cover. They had to escape from the bomb dogs. But it was fascinating to see that operation in being, because what I didn't realise until then was that everywhere the Pope goes, there's a huge detachment to go with him. It's a bit like president or royal family or head of state, and including Vatican Radio. It's a radio which broadcasts continually to the Roman Catholic world, and they bring their own broadcast systems and aerials and everything wherever the Pope is. And they broadcast updates of what's been going on and where the Pope is and who he's been seeing, etc., etc. So it's kind of like a running commentary on the Pope's visit. And he also had his own security team with him, who are mainly ex-Swiss Secret Service. And I suppose when you think about the Swiss Guard, the Vatican and the connection there, it's hardly a surprise. But the man in charge, his sort of chief of staff on that visit, was a very interesting man, huge, big, tall man, Archbishop Marcinkus. And Marcinkus was a priest from Chicago who had been seconded to the Vatican to look after the Pope's interests, John Paul II. But he looked like a typical big Chicago gangster and very, very direct. I actually met the Pope because he came out to shake hands with us, and it was so pleasant because he was a vigorous young man. He was a man in his 50s. I think he'd been a good footballer in his younger years, if I remember correctly. And so he was powerful, he was strong, he was vibrant, so unlike the traditional pictures of popes who are old men being carried about in chairs and stuff like that. He was something completely different. Clearly a man with an immense personality. You could see that exuding from him. And of course, he led the security detail a merry dance because he didn't do exactly what he was told to do. So, for instance, he came into the Cardinal's residence and all the gates were closed and he was secure. And then he came out of the house and went up to the gate to speak to various well-wishers and shake their hands and all that. Of course, and back out his security detail come. They weren't quite sure what he was going to do. But he was a very impressive figure, John Paul. And that was a very, very interesting police detail. That was yeah.
Brilliant, Tom. Thanks for that. Martin, while that was going on, you were in your bed. You'd just done your first night shift.
That's right, yeah. I remember being woken up by the clatter of the Pope's helicopter as he was flying over my house on the way to the Notre Dame College in Bearsden.
So how did you get to the ID branch there? What's the passage that took you there?
Well, I joined the job with a view to using my photographic skills. I always thought there would be a time when I would apply for it. I didn't know how successful I would be. They weren't actually looking for anybody. Suddenly I found myself in the IB. You've got a very technical bent to you. I mean, to be a good scenes of crime officer, to be a photographer of that quality, then you have to have enormous attention to detail. I'm not sure whether I could have done that, So that's the great thing about the police, of course, as Simon was saying earlier, or not only is it a job which attracts a wide range of people, there's actually a niche for everyone. Now, some people never find it, but it's there.
It sounds to me as if you found your niche when you went into the ID branch.
Without a doubt, absolutely without a doubt. I enjoyed nearly every day I was in there. I felt I was making a valuable contribution. You went from just being a middle-of-the-roader, a number in the division. You had detective supers and chief supers asking you for advice and being grateful for it. Knew I was giving them a good service with quality photographs. You were sitting in on major incident briefings. Your contribution was taken on board. I'm thriving on this. This is why I'm in this job.
You said you'd listened to the podcast on the World's End and Robert Black, but the World's End particularly shows how important, how vitally important scenes of crime officers are. And as I went up through the ranks in the CID, I became more and more aware that a good scenes of crime team could do for you. They could absolutely turn the case round for you, or they could lose it for you.
That department was full of characters of all sorts, but everybody really got their professional head on and got on with it, and there were sort of really, really competent people who did a sterling service when the chips are down, which was quite often.
Were you in a team of mixed disciplines? So were there scientists and photographers? Was it mixed police and civilian to start with? How did it work?
Well, when I went in there, it was half and half civilians and cops. Overall in charge was the chief inspector. There were 2 inspectors and 2 sergeants, and probably about a dozen cops. Similar number of civvies. Most of the bread and butter work during the day was going out doing fingerprint examinations, which I took to quite quickly and found I was thoroughly enjoying it. Probably only about 10% of what we did was photography. And most of the photography of serious things was the domain of the people who were on call, because it mostly happened out of hours. There was always 2 photographers on call. You took all your kit home in a works van. So there were 2 vans, and it was just potluck where that person lived in relation to what work came in. Covered the whole of Strathclyde. But on call, it was really exclusively photography based. Anything that needed to be done from a scene examination point would be preserved and then looked at the next day by the guys who were in day shift. It wasn't just crime, it was fatal road accidents, suicides, everything.
Were you also a fingerprints expert then?
No, we just went and recovered the fingerprints, either lifting them with tape or photographing them, or we collected items which couldn't be fingerprinted at the locus and took them back to the specialist examination room, where they'd be treated with various chemical processes to enhance the marks. But actually assessing the fingerprints and doing the identification from them, that was SCRO. They were just purely office-based experts. All they did all day was simply look at fingerprints.
It's worth mentioning there that to be an expert, and regarded as the court as an expert for fingerprint evidence, you had to have 7 years' experience of examining fingerprints full time. It was very important, fingerprints, but it was also just as important that we preserve the integrity of the system to make sure that there was never any mistakes made, that there was never any misidentification. So the standard, the bar was really, really high in court, and it remains so for expert witnesses in any field. Can I just retrack a wee bit, Martin, and get you to tell us, there's a few assumptions in there, right? IB is the Identification Bureau. That's who you were. And you oversaw the IB activities throughout Strathclyde, because there was also an office in Dumbarton. There was one at Paisley.
Dumbarton, Paisley, Motherwell and Ayr.
And I worked in Argyll, where DOs did their own scenes of crime in Oban, Dunoon, Campbelltown, Rossi, etc. We all did our own, but we all fed into the major IB system and obviously the same SCRO. SCRO is the Scottish Criminal Record Office. Tom, do you want to tell us a wee bit about SCRO just for our listeners so they know what we're talking about?
SCRO started with the Glasgow Fingerprints Bureau, and the Glasgow Fingerprints Bureau was set up by none other than Percy Sillitoe, the great Sir Percy Sillitoe that I've written about and we've spoken about on this very podcast. He was the visionary. There were fingerprints branches in the big forces before Percy Sillitoe arrived in 1931, but it was really he that supercharged it and brought experts from the south up and really built a bureau which would compete with the Metropolitan Police's Bureau and was on a par with the FBI Fingerprints Bureau in Washington. So it was really Percy Sillitoe that built the Glasgow Fingerprints Bureau to be world-renowned. And of course, subsequently, the Glasgow Fingerprint Bureau became Strathclyde Police and became the Scottish Criminal Records Office, holding not only fingerprints but photographs for people who were on SCRO. So criminals convicted of a certain crime would be on SCRO, and criminals, shall we say, less serious, would be on LP, which is local photograph. So behind somebody's name, there would be an LP number and an SCRO number, which referred to their criminal record and any forensic matters which related to them, like fingerprints and teeth impressions and photographs, of course, current photographs. So that's the origins of SCRO, and of course it's still going today.
When you went into work in the morning, a day shift or a late shift, I remember going over there in the morning to meet with the boss, the inspector or whatever, regarding whatever inquiry we were doing. I was generally the message boy, and there'd be a super somewhere saying, Simon, go and find out how they're getting on with such and such. There was always a flurry about 8 o'clock in the morning. You would all appear and get allocated. There was a big board that they would put the jobs up on, and that was your jobs for the day.
That's right. Out with probably about half a dozen or more jobs in the morning. Usually the two of you would go out. The jobs would be broadly in the same geographical area.
For the benefit of our listeners here, there's no doubt plenty of our listeners have had to report things to the police, their garden shed, for example, or a break-in, a car, or whatever it might be. And scenes of crime is a crucial part of every inquiry, regardless of the crime. Let's pick a high-value housebreaking, Martin, if you don't mind. And for the benefit of our listeners who might never have experienced this or maybe have, tell us the process then, what they should be doing to protect the crime scene, whatever. You tell us your thoughts as you turn up at a crime scene of a high-value housebreaking.
The most important part, almost always, is the point of entry. So we would ask people where possible, without leaving the place insecure or leaving the place not wind and watertight anymore, to try and protect a point of entry. Tidy up as little as possible as you can as well. But what is of particular value, even more so with DNA, is anything which has been left behind by the housebreaker is of far, far more value than anything that has been moved. A cigarette butt being a classic, or cigarette, they'd often use cigarette lighters as a source of light rather than using a torch, from which you're almost guaranteed to get DNA. A well-known housebreaker dropped a screwed up letter out of his pocket, and it was a letter that had been sent to him by the school complaining about the non-attendance of his daughter. That was a pretty easy one to solve.
Was that a clue?
It was a bit of a clue, yeah. So touch as little as you can. Have a good look about that there's nothing that's been introduced to the house that's foreign to the house. When we went to a crime scene, the first thing to look at was a point of entry. Probably more often than not, you found the criminals had gone there prepared, and they were almost invariably wearing gloves, and you could establish that. They were probably more opportunist in some of the housing schemes, and more likely to not go prepared, climbing in through windows without wearing gloves, etc. It became more apparent when DNA came into being. There were much different ways of doing things. Like, for instance, I got a DNA ident once. Guy, obvious glove marks, the guy been climbing in the window, but there was a greasy mark about a foot below the point of entry, which I correctly deduced was probably a smudge from his forehead as his head had connected to the window when he was climbing through. Took a little swab from that, and of course, bingo, you get a DNA hit from it. Another one I went to once it was a high-class joinery place at the sort of Bearsden end of Mary Hill. But there'd been a very high-value housebreaking there. Glove marks all over the place. They'd dismantled the CCTV cameras. But at the last minute, one of them had opened up somebody's piece box that was there and took a bite out of a piece of cheese. And away they went.
It was a big mouse you were looking for.
This guy came up to me. He says, they've been in my piece box and bitten my cheese. Thanks very much. So actually, it's a casting of the bite mark in the cheese, having taken a DNA swab. And of course, we came up with some prolific housebreaker. I think it was from Kilmarnock. Talk yourself out of that one, pal. You know, it was little things like that you got a great deal of satisfaction from.
When I worked in the rural areas and did my own scenes of crime, I always was conscious of building up a bank. And it was fibres as well from stolen cars, fibres from the glass climbing in the window, whatever it might be. I was always particular about storing them and sending them off because I knew they were going to come good eventually in a rural area. Do you know what I mean? I knew that maybe a year or two down the road that there would be a roll-up from it.
My experience, though, was that there was crime scene examiners and there were crime scene investigators. And the difference was that there were some people in our identification branch who would come along to a scene and, just as you say, look for likely places for fingerprints and hairs and fibres and take photographs, etc., etc. And then there were the other people, like yourself, as you described, who came along and looked at a scene and said, well, what could have happened here? And where could I look? How does this work? How has this person come in? What's the hypothesis? How's he come in? What could he have touched? Is that smudge mark on the glass his forehead? So that they're more investigators. It's a way of thinking. And of course, very quickly, if you were an inquiry DO, you knew who the good ones were, and you would always phone up and say, who's on call? Who's on call for crime scenes? Oh, it's Jimmy so-and-so. When's Freddie on? Oh, Freddie's on this afternoon. Right, I'll leave it till 2 o'clock.
Martin, that's a great insight into your job. I'm sure we could go on all night about scenes of crime officers, that's for sure. And it's something that we'll return to many times here on Crime Time Inc. because it's such a big part of what we do as police officers. But I want to push us on a wee bit because you weren't long in the IB, I don't think, when you had your first really big murder case that came up. Can you tell us a wee bit about that and about how it started off?
Yes, usually when you joined the IB, it was at least a year before you get put on call, and you had to go on training call with a senior person for a week. It was basically 7 nights on the trot before you were deemed to be suitable to go out on your own. Because I'd had a photographic background and I was able to demonstrate that I was completely competent with the camera, they put me on training call after I'd been there for only about 6 months. And it started on a Monday night. I was working with one of the senior civvies called Bob McLaren, who's a wonderful character. He's sadly no longer with us. The zaniest sense of humour you could ever possibly imagine. But he also was very good when he put his serious hat on. It was on the Saturday night. Bob called me and said we had a murder scene to go to in Hamilton. Body of a young girl. I don't think she was 19. She was a drama student. She was found in the corner of a car park in Miller Street in Hamilton, a small area of more or less wasteland that was covered in sort of thick foliage, bushes and shrubbery, etc. And she had been found there, essentially naked, horrific injuries. Her face was unrecognisable. She'd had twigs and branches pushed into her nose and her mouth and private parts. She had long flowing red locks which are trailing on the ground amongst all the shrubbery, matted with blood.
Okay, Martin, this was May the 30th, 1992. Can you tell us then what the scene is like when you arrive? Because the police are there, obviously. The police have cordoned the area off. Can you describe that scene to us, what you're confronted with there then, with this body of this poor girl?
Yeah, okay. I'm confronted with she's not immediately visible from the corner of the car park. There's various uniformed cops have established a cordon, CID milling about. I arrived first, explained that I was actually technically a trainee. We were waiting on Bob McLaren to arrive. I got my paper suit on and got the film loaded in the camera and get everything set up, waited for Bob to come. And then we were directed at a gap between two of the bushes and to make our way in there, maybe about 5 or 6 paces. And then to our left, poor Amanda's remains lying flat on her back. You couldn't actually see her unless you walked into this area of shrubbery.
Okay, so is the scene protected properly at that time? What's your thoughts on police officers protecting the scene?
It was very, very much more basic than it is now, but bear in mind that I'm kind of 20 years out of date with regards to what the current thinking is. The big thing was common approach path, and only those that really had a need to go in would go in. I think that was pretty much adhered to. I went in with the paper suit, supervised by Bob. It was pitch black. We had to use a torch to focus. And then the technique was to leave the camera shutter open and fire off several flashes on the same frame from different angles. Close the shutter again, wind on and do the same thing again, bracketing different exposures to make sure you got it right. And at the time, murders were always videoed as well as still photographs. Bob probably correctly assessed that I had more than enough in my hands doing the stills at such a complicated scene. So he took over the responsibility of doing the video, but eventually joined by, I think it was a chap called Campbell Stuart, scientist from the lab. He came out, did a few takings, took a few blood samples, etc., had a look around with his torch for any other blood staining nearby. And thereafter, the body was fairly quickly removed to the Glasgow City mortuary, which I understand is rather different to the way things are done nowadays. I think nowadays there's been much more work done at the locus with the body still in situ.
So there was no tent put up or anything?
It wasn't possible to put a tent up at that location. The foliage was just too thick. Fortunately, it was a nice, dry, balmy summer's evening. so the tent was not really required anyway.
Was there somebody taking details of anybody approaching the scene? That was it taped off?
Yes, it was certainly taped off. The senior officer was DCI Kenny Morrison.
Okay, Tom?
That sounds pretty good to me. It doesn't sound at all haphazard. Tell us about Amanda then. Who was she? What was her background?
A young girl from Hamilton. She was a drama student, lived with her parents and a younger brother. A good-natured girl from a good family. No antecedents that were of any major sort of red flags. She had basically been at a night out and she had encountered a chap who she was acquainted with called Francis David Auld. He had been the last person who had been seen with her.
He was known to her?
Yes, he was known to her.
They'd been seen together a short time before she disappeared, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
I think the time of death, Martin, was established around about 1 o'clock in the morning, something like that, and he'd been seen with her about half an hour before, Tom, coming from the dance.
Yeah, she'd been there basically all day on the Saturday, undiscovered. This is the early hours of Saturday morning, discovered in the evening. When he was arrested, the bite mark on her breast was examined and it was conclusively identified by Professor MacDonald of the Glasgow Dental Hospital that this mark had definitely been made by Francis Auld, at which point he admitted that he had been involved in a heavy petting session with her and had put this bite mark there. But this pathologist said that that would have been an excruciatingly painful bite, and there's no way that could be covered under the remit of heavy petting.
It's interesting, this business about the aggressive rather than romantic biting. That came very much into the World's End murders as well. Was this forensic odontology about not just about the bite, but about the nature of the bite? It's interesting.
Francis Auld went on trial for this case, for this murder, for the murder of Amanda. Tell us the evidence against him then, from your perspective, the forensic evidence.
The next day, as was always the case, we went back and photographed the locus in daylight, and along with a forensic scientist again. A more extensive search is done. There were uniformed cops there, and they were basically bagging up every piece of litter that was within this area of waste ground in case it should prove of any value. The most important thing that was noticed was that on a low branch, probably only about a foot or so above from where Amanda had been lying, there were some long strands of black hair adhering to some of the branches, which the lab man took away. Subsequent examination revealed that I can't remember what stage DNA was at the time or what technique had been used, but I do remember the statistic that was quoted that there was a 1 in 44,000 chance of this hair belonging to anybody other than Frankie Auld. Frankie had a long black ponytail. I'm sure these long black hairs tied him pretty conclusively to the scene. He also could not account for not having his jacket. It was a leather jacket that he'd been wearing when he'd been seen with Amanda earlier that evening. And he could not account for the absence of this jacket. He came up with what was essentially a cock and bull story to Hamilton CID. I remember being called out a couple of days later that he had climbed a tree in the middle of a field somewhere nearby, which he said he often did when he was drunk. And he'd climbed up that, and he must have left his jacket up the tree. And of course, a search was made. There was no sign of the jacket. I was called out to photograph the tree anyway, as a matter of course.
So the conclusion that Tom and I are making from that is that the jacket was blood-stained or whatever, and he got rid of it. Pronto.
Of course. Yeah. Of course.
We've got forensic evidence. So we've got the bite mark, which is definitely him. He's pretty much admitting that as well in the interviews or whatever, as far as we know. He can't get out of that, but he's trying to give some spurious reason for that. But the physical evidence, his hair is found not a matter of feet away from where the deceased is found.
Inches away, on a low branch.
He can't account for the clothing he was wearing at the time, the jacket he had on, he can't account for. In your view, then, was it more than enough to go to trial with, to go on the
Absolutely.
charge of murder?
It should have been a stonewaller.
And what was the outcome of the case? I take it went to trial. You all gave evidence?
Yes, it did indeed. It went to trial. Donald Finlay was defending him.
Are you aware of any specific defence that was used, or...?
I believe his defence was that he left her in the company of another unidentified male.
Right, that rings a bell, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the fact that he must have left his jacket up a tree. Other than that, I don't believe there was much of a defence at all. Finlay's basically final submission was along the lines that to the jury that the the Crown would have you believe that this young man turned from being an ordinary young man into a monster overnight, and then turned back into being an ordinary young man again. A great tragedy happened that night when that girl lost her life. Don't allow this to be another great tragedy by finding my client guilty.
The recovery of the hair, was that done after Auld was in custody or before?
Probably before. I don't know the timescale of when he was taken into custody, but I would imagine it would be before.
You see, had it been after, then one of the defence boys would say, well, yeah, okay, it's been introduced into the scene.
When those hairs were recovered, we went back and looked at the photographs which I had taken on the night she was found. We could clearly identify those hairs. Oh, but we hadn't picked up on it at the time, but they could clearly be seen in one or two of my photographs. That would have been able to have been refuted.
Was Auld admitting being at the locus, but just not killing?
Yes, and the fact that these hairs were so low down, he'd have had to have had his head near the ground, which is where the deceased was, for these hairs to have become entangled in the branches. They were in such close proximity to the deceased that was of obviously greater evidential value than if they'd just been higher up on a branch, a few feet away. They really were right at the heart of the crime scene.
What was the outcome of the trial then, Martin?
The outcome of the trial, unbelievably, for all concerned, was not proven.
And did that come as a real shock to everyone at the time?
It did. And looking back on it, it was one of the low points of my police career when I saw that on the TV that night when I came home from work one day.
What was the thinking behind it?
Just an absolutely ridiculous decision by a jury. I'm going to tell you something now, which I don't know whether you'll want to use in the recording. Many years later, one of the scientists in the lab told me that he had been at a night out and a lady had approached him and said, "You were the scientist in the Amanda Duffy case, weren't you?" And he said, "Yeah, that's right." He said, "How do you know?" She says, "I was on the jury." He said, "I couldn't help it." I know I'm not allowed to ask you this, but how the hell did you come up with the not proven? How did you not find him guilty? To which she replied, "Well, it was the missing evidence." He says, "Oh, what do you mean by the missing evidence?" He says, "Oh, the fact that the police couldn't find his jacket." That is apparently what made all the difference. This jury thought the fact that the police hadn't found his jacket had ruined the case, rather than looking at the obvious other side of the coin to that was he'd obviously disposed of his jacket, and why?
Tom?
The fact that the jacket disappeared is actually evidence for the prosecution, not
Of
against
course
it.
it is. Of course it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
The jury didn't see it that way.
You tend to believe that people who work for the Crown Office, advocate deputies and whatnot, are infallible and highly intelligent and all the rest of it. I've no doubt they are highly intelligent, but they're certainly not infallible. I'm a great supporter of trial by jury and of juries, and more often than not, I think juries come to common sense decisions if they're properly briefed, but sometimes they're not.
That includes the summing up by the AD and very much the guidance given from the bench for the jury, because once they go in that room, they would have to come out and ask a question and they can be led down the wrong road. But it's surprising to me that we get the good results that we do over the piece, because it's such a fragile process that we have.
Trial judge was Lord Sutherland, and apparently when the jury came in and returned that verdict, normally the trial judge thanks the jury for their attention, blah, blah, blah. Apparently he just dismissed them, and anecdotally he just stood up and slammed his paperwork down on the desk and stormed off.
So let's move forward then, because, we're in shock a wee bit just thinking back to it, and it's such a horrific miscarriage of justice. But it is what it is, and we all have to go on with our lives. In that case in particular, were you involved in what happened there? Oh, it never did get to trial again. In Tom's case, we managed to get the law changed in the country to get a second bite at the cherry if you want, and Tom can tell us a wee bit about that, although we've covered it in The World's End. And that's what was due to happen. I think round about 2015, Martin, Strathclyde Police tried to get another trial.
They did. I'd retired at that point.
Okay.
Contacted by Hamilton CID. They were trying to get Frankie Auld on the double jeopardy legislation. I had to go to the Fiscal's office in Ballater Street for another precognition, looking at all the photographs again. And we were told it was going to have to go to 3 judges to make a decision as to whether there was going to be another trial of Frankie Auld. They can't just run it again on the same evidence. I think the weak point was that there wasn't any additional evidence to put him to trial on, or very little.
I think one thing we should mention for our listeners is that Amanda Duffy's family took a civil action against Francis Auld, which they won. and they won £50,000 in damages. We should explain that the law and the burden of proof as regards a civil case is at much lower crossbar than it is in a criminal court. And the money was never paid. There was never any danger of it being paid. But it gave the Duffys some satisfaction to be able to do that, because I think everyone knew that Francis Auld was the culprit here. So the double jeopardy attempt failed, Martin. Have you any knowledge of what became of Mr. Auld?
Mr. Auld, he got married, and shortly thereafter, he died of cancer at a very young age, in his early 40s. Some might say that was karma in all its glory. But
so let's draw a line under that for now, Martin. Thanks very much for sharing that with us, and I'm sure that will be a great insight to a lot of our listeners out there who can now contact us through our website and through other sources, can even leave voice messages, and I'm sure that will instigate a lot of questions and comments out there, hopefully, because that's what we're here for. Let me move on then and kind of dovetail that, bookend your career in the IB, because that was one of your first cases, your training week. Yeah. And let's move towards the end of your time with the IB then, and another murder here in Glasgow, a horrific murder of an 8-year-old boy, Mark Cummings. Were you on call at that time, Martin?
yeah, I got the phone call that they'd found the body of a child at the bottom of a chute, as they described, at some high flats in Springburn. I wasn't quite sure what they meant by a chute, but they said that this child had last been seen in the company of a known paedophile. And I arrived, and it was one of the high flats in Charles Street in Springburn. Full circus was there with cordons, etc. This little boy had been reported missing by his mother. The schools broke up for the summer holidays that day.
25th of June 2004.
And the story was that Mark and his little pal were out there just wearing shorts. It was a hot summer's day. And they came across this character called Stuart Leggett, a known sex offender who was changing a wheel in his car at the time. And they offered him some assistance, which he accepted, and the boys ended up covered in grease. He then said to the boys, "You better come up with me and I'll get that grease cleaned off you. And I've got some video games you can play, blah, blah, blah." I think he was on the 9th floor, if I remember rightly. The boys went up the stairwell with him. One of the wee boys decided it wasn't for him and left the scene. Mark went away with this character. His mum eventually reported him missing later on that afternoon, and a search revealed the wee soul was dead within one of those big industrial wheelie bins. It was the communal rubbish chute where everybody in the high flats put the rubbish and it all goes down and ends up in one of these bins. Poor Mark's remains were in that, covered with, I remember, wallpaper scrapings that somebody had obviously innocently thrown down afterwards. Spent the entire night in that bin shed, painstakingly photographing, videoing the scene. He was thereafter removed to the Glasgow City mortuary for a subsequent post-mortem, which was carried out that morning.
When you're at a scene like that, Martin, are you working closely with the forensic boys, with the scientists?
The room was so small, I was working essentially with one guy was doing video, one guy doing stills in a very, very cramped space, under the supervision of the forensic scientists who would be coming and taking samples as we were removing things. Productions officers bagging up various bits and pieces that were on top of him.
I think it's worth emphasising there, or pointing out, that the importance of those initial photographs, and you've already mentioned it with the Amanda Duffy case, that you took initial photographs in the dark using your flash. The scene was pretty much undisturbed at that point. Somebody had obviously declared life extinct, etc., but basically undisturbed. And those photographs are a crucial part of the case moving forward. As Tom pointed out, you could see the hairs Auld had left behind at the scene, and nobody could ever refute that because of those initial photographs. So the body being in situ, and this could be in a house or anywhere, it could be clocks, it could be the tiniest detail. Those photographs in future can prove what the scene looked like at that, or anything left behind by the accused, of course, we could prove was there. So those initial photographs are very, very important to everything that follows thereafter.
Yep.
What would you do forensically there then? Would there be a fingerprint exam of some kind at that time to the door of the place or to the chutes, or all the chutes? How many flights are there at Charles Street? There must be 22, 24
Yeah,
flights.
that's right. Anything that was on top of the boy would taken away and submitted to the specialist examination room for fingerprint or forensic examination. It was more focused on the house where Stuart Leggett lived rather than the shoot.
Was he identified quickly?
Yes, there was a police cordon around the place. They knew from CCTV who he was. He was nowhere to be found. And then during the course of the evening, he turned up at the cordon with a pizza, asking for access to his house. And the cops asked him what his name was, and he said Stuart Leggett, and it was, all right, you're coming with us, pal.
No, it was, you're not obliged to say anything, Martin. That's what it was.
Yeah, of course that. For some reason, he'd taken the boy's clothing to a cliff at North Berwick.
Right.
And disposed of it there. Can't remember what cock and bull story it was he came up with. He'd been to North Berwick with the boy's clothing, and then he'd returned, bought himself a pizza, and then tried to bluff his way back into his flat when he was arrested. Full and frank admissions were made right from the word go.
He must have known that his chances of getting caught by Lothian and Borders detectives were much less if he went through to North Berwick, obviously.
Well.
Tom?
I'm not even going to rise to that occasion.
I know.
It's a fascinating story. We tend to talk about the sort of mystery murders that we've dealt with and come across, but the truth of the matter is most murders are exactly like that, where the culprit is very, very quickly identified.
And most are domestic. Most people are murdered by people close to them, by people in the same household, actually. Yeah. So that's a good point, Tom.
Yeah. So the photographs, again, was my only involvement in that. Because we've been up all night, it was a different team that were sent out during the day to do the fingerprint and forensic examination of his house. On the Sunday, I was back at work, and I recall being sent to London Road Police Office, if I recall correctly, where this character, Stuart Leggett, was in custody. And I was led to believe that he had made a full and frank confession to the CID officers that were interviewing him. He subsequently pled guilty to the offence, and as I recall, he received a sentence of life with a minimum of 20 years. And I've just noticed that recently that 20 years has now expired. He's now up for parole, and I believe his father is vehemently opposing this. While I was at London Road Police Office, I was required to photograph Stuart Leggett. He was dressed in a white forensic suit, and the reason for the photograph was he had a very small cut on his forehead, which had possibly been caused by a fingernail of young Mark Cummings in the course of some sort of a struggle. And I remember when I was taking the photograph, Leggett just had the faintest trace of a smirk on his face, which you can actually see in my photograph. And I remember it took an enormous amount of willpower not to smack him in the face with the Nikon F3, but fortunately we managed to avoid going down that route. We had one of those critical incident debriefs. It was the first one I'd ever actually gone to. And I remember a couple of the DOs from Baird Street told me that they had been standing on the cliff where the clothing had been left with the Leggett, and it had gone through their mind that it might be a good idea to push him over the edge, but obviously, again, sensible heads prevailed and they did not do that. But it just gives you an idea that when you're confronted with such evil, the irrational thoughts that can go through your head, but your police training kicks in and you realise that it's perhaps not a good idea to go down that route. That photograph, which I took of Leggett in custody that day, was released by Strathclyde Police to the media, and it's become something of an iconic, for want of a better word, photograph. If ever there's any reference made in the media to the case, or if anyone does a Google search, it's that photograph which is always comes to the fore. That was essentially my own personal involvement in the Mark Cummings murder, the Stuart Leggett case.
So, Martin, part of the process at a murder scene, or at any death for that matter, that might be suspicious or unexplained, part of your job will be obviously photographing the scene itself, the locus, but do you then get involved at the mortuary in these cases and the postmortems?
Yes, we do. We take a series of photographs of the under the direction of the pathologists. There was a certain routine of standard photographs. We take full-length views of the body from each side when it's still fully dressed, full-length views both sides when the body's undressed, and close-up facial view, and then once the body's been washed down again, it's standard full-length views both sides and the face. Thereafter, it's purely at the direction of the pathologist. They'll usually chart every mark and quite some time, usually before they actually start making any incisions, just charting every mark and injury that they can find on the body in very, very great detail.
It's interesting to point out to our listeners as well that the police procedures in these instances are exactly the same. They're controlled, they're regulated, there's procedures, they're followed the same all the time because over the years of investigations we've found the best way to do these. And the pathologist is the same, it's very methodical because the pathologist, Tom, this touches on what you were saying earlier, the pathologist is looking at for the cause of death primarily, time of death or projected as best they can using the modern techniques now are fantastic. He or she is looking at the causes of death, whereas the police officer that's there is looking at it from a completely different perspective, Tom, is that right?
Well, that's right, and that's how it should be. You should have complementary skills there. But I have to say that some of the most experienced pathologists are forensic investigators. So it's not just, here is the knife wound that killed him. They'll say, well, here is a knife wound, and from the angle of the knife wound and from the depth of the knife wound, you're looking for a weapon that's double-edged, that's 4 inches long, the blade, and it looks like somebody that struck him from behind or from a left hand. So, again, just like crime scene examiners, there are forensic scientists and pathologists who can tell you an awful lot more because they're much more than just clinicians. They're actually people who can analyse and come up with some suppositions, some theories about the crime.
There's so many of these specialities. Ballistics is one that I had a lot of dealings with over the years as well. And what's amazing, Martin, is you could go to a crime scene and, as you described earlier, if you're just there to go through the motions, you could put powder across the point of entry, you could dust a bit here and dust a bit there, take some illumination prints from the householder and whatever. You can go through the motions. But a good scenes of crime officer is taking a step back from that. When I did scenes of crime, I used to walk round it a couple of times from outside and have a think about point of entry, have a think about vehicles, have a think about what direction they might have come in, what neighbours might have been about, or what CCTV, although that was rare in those days. So it's been able to take that step back. Ballistics is important like that. On the simple form, you could say, oh yeah, there was a gunshot in the sitting room. But a ballistics analysis would give you so much information about what Tom's talking about there. The same with blood and blood splatter. It's an absolute fascinating science. So when did you retire? What service did you have, Martin?
I had 30 years retired in 2012. Spent my last 7 years in A Division.
Martin, I can't thank you enough for what you've done here. This is why we exist at Crime Time Inc. We want the truth, we want the facts, we want them undiluted, we want them from the people who were there and who dealt with these incidents as they happen. I know that doing this can open a tin of worms for anyone that was involved. So on behalf of myself and Tom and the team here at Crime Time Inc., and especially on behalf of our growing army of listeners out there, thanks very much for going through that with us in such detail and being so frank with us. Thanks very much, Martin, and I hope we see you again here on Crime Time Inc.
Thank you. Well, you're very, very welcome, and I'm very pleased to come on, and I hope my contribution has been of some use. You are right, of course, that, there are some boxes in the mind which are best left closed, but occasionally they do have to be open for the greater good and for the benefit of other younger people's experience and the knowledge of the general public. And I'm more than happy to get involved in that capacity. And thank you for asking me to come on.
Not at all, and I'm sure we'll have you on again when you've recovered from this episode. Thanks, man.
Anytime at all, Simon. Oh, it'll be a pleasure. Absolutely.
Cheers,
Okie dokie.
Good night.
Okie dokie.
Bye.
Thanking you. Cheers now. Good night.
Take care.
Thanks, Tom. Next time on Crime Time Inc.
And I went to the FBI Academy in 1987. One of the things they used to do was they used to invite people to come and speak to the Academy group, which is about 200 strong, not to celebrate their victories, but to analyse their defeats. There was one guy who came and lectured us about a horrendous shooting incident down in Miami where some of his colleagues had been shot by an armed gang of Haitians. And I said to the instructor afterwards, I said, really? Felt a bit uncomfortable for the guy. He says, no, he says it's part of his therapy. He said it's actually good for him to talk about it and relive it. He said we don't do it unthinkingly. We do it as part of this guy's recovery therapy.